I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff.
And I'm Matt Bernico.
And this week we're talking to Patti Talbot, team lead of Global Partnerships for the United Church of Canada. Really excited to talk to Patti about peace in Korea and what's going on in Korea, especially with Christianity on both sides of the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. So lots of really great content. I'm really happy that we were able to chat with her. Before we do that, though, we usually do a little Patreon plug here, but we're going to take a break from that to tell you about something else. Matt, do you want to tell us about that? Something else?
Yeah, I would love to. This feels much more natural, and I feel much more confident just saying something else that's not asking people for money. So listen, we all love cool religious people doing interesting political things, and there's nothing more religious or cool than the Kings Bay Plowshare 7. Maybe you haven't heard about these folks, but basically they are, loosely defined, some Catholic worker type folks who broke into a nuclear facility and defaced it in sort of a prophetic way. You should go read more about them if you don't know about them. You can go to kingsbayplowshare7.org and you can read their whole story and kind of see their releases and stuff like that. The whole action took place several years ago now, and many of the folks who took part in the action are in prison in one way or another. And they're all really fascinating people that I think have a really unique witness to the world, and not only as Christians, but also just as activists, as anti-nuclear activists. And we should probably pay attention to them. So like I said, they are incarcerated right now. And what's cool is that on their website, you can go there and find their sort of address with regards to the carceral system, and you can write them a letter. And maybe you should do that. So I just want to throw it out there. kingsbayplowshare7.org. There's a big button on the front page that says write to them, and you can do that. So maybe just drop them a nice letter. And if you're feeling so led, you can also team up with Abolition Apostles and write other folks letters too. And that would be a nice thing to do. So listen, give us money on Patreon if you want to, but definitely write people in prison a letter. It's a nice thing.
Yep, we'll definitely get someone on the show sometime soon. I hope to talk about the Kings Bay Plowshare 7, but in the meantime, they could all, I'm sure, use a good word from outside. Okay, let's take it over to Patti. Welcome to the show, Patti. Lately, we've been having some conversations about solidarity movements and Christianity, and because of the work that you've done with the United Church of Canada in Northeast Asia, especially on the Korean Peninsula and a number of other places, we thought that you'd be a good person to talk with and kind of get our minds in a different part of the globe. We spend most of our time, I think, talking about Latin America, so it'll be helpful to hear a little bit more about your work. Before we get into that, could you maybe just tell us a little bit about your work and yourself? How did you get involved in this kind of work?
Well, great. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to have the invitation from Magnificast and to talk with you both. Just briefly, I serve on the national staff of the United Church of Canada as team leader in its Global Partnership program. And just to set the United Church a little bit in context, it's the largest Protestant denomination in Canada. and was established actually with an act of union in 1925 when the Methodist Church, the Congregationalist Church, and a good part of the Presbyterian Church joined together. So a little, not quite 100 years ago, but close to it, they created this united being that has had some other joiners along the way. And today it has about 2,700, 2,800 congregations from sea to sea to sea, and is involved in a number of different kinds of ministries, outreach, community, and others here in Canada. I lead the Global Partnerships team, and for the United Church, Global Partnerships means working with about 80 organizations around the world, Africa, Middle East, Asia, Latin America, as well as some global networks. The organizations are quite a wide variety of type. They include national churches, they include civil society groups, ecumenical organizations, and a wide range of foci. But basically, they're partners, organizations that share our goals as the United Church of Canada, of working in what we call justice-seeking work together.
That's all great to hear about. It definitely gives some good context to the situation. I want to ask you some questions, I think, about Christianity and solidarity movements. But before we do that, could you say a little bit more about some of those, some of the big ideas you just kind of threw out there? What does it mean to be a justice-seeking movement? What's the church after in those contexts?
Well, yeah, good question. And for me, it may seem kind of simplistic, but it kind of goes back to Jesus and the person that we know of Jesus Christ, and the model of ministry that he showed, or at least that's recorded for us in the part of the Bible that we call the Newer Testament, what his ministry was all about. And in the person of Jesus, the person of Jesus and the life that he lived, his ministry, his engagement. For some of us, that's a good demonstration of the divine vision for humanity and creation. Jesus in his recorded ministry, he sought to show compassion. He sought to teach how to live in love with others, and he preached a lot about justice, particularly for those in power who were maintaining a system of empire that oppressed and marginalized a whole lot of people. So I think, at least for me, I can't speak for other Christians, but for me, that justice seeking is about trying to follow some of those examples of living in compassion, walking in love, and seeking a sense of wholeness or rightness that is what we hope the divine wants for all people, what we believe the divine wants for all people and creation.
Yeah, I think I really resonate with that, with what you're saying there about Christianity. I think that's really a good way to put some of that motivating force behind it with justice. I think so. In my experience with Christianity, which is again not everyone's, but I think I come from a very sort of individualistic and like evangelical background. I think that's probably where a lot of the big weird spiritual baggage that I'm still dealing with comes from. But I think it's really fascinating though to find Christians who find the ideas of peace and justice, doing this type of solidarity work as something that is not individualistic, but it's about reaching out to other communities. So
Yeah.
I don't know, could you tell us how all of that works out? Like, this is more than just, thinking the right beliefs in your own individual heads, but it's about reaching out and connecting with other people around the world. I guess, how does that play into it all?
Yeah, very much so. I think that at the core of human existence is relationship with others, and I think, at least for me as a Christian, seeking to really to reflect what it means to live and work and present a reality to the world of what I seek to be, that it is about being in relationship with others. That when we think about how we live, it's in relationship with others. And for me, that the engagement in justice seeking, peace movement, solidarity work is recognizing that together we can be much more than we can ever be, either individually or even in our own communities. That seeking to work with others is really the only way toward the vision of wholeness. That separately and individually we're just that, we're parts. I think part of the challenge in maybe the church, the Christian faith, and perhaps other faiths as well, is this sense of exclusivity, that somehow that we have the right way, or the right way of approaching the challenges of humanity and creation. And my experience is that it's important to let that go, and to know that whether people of other faiths or people of goodwill, there is much wisdom and insight and power to be found in alliances. And it's often the hope of the vision that can bring us together, even as we come from very different starting points.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Patty, and I think it's a really nice way to contextualize some of the more kind of institutional work that you do and that the United Church does as coming out of this this deeper commitment to what it means to be with other people. One thing that I really appreciate about the United Church is that institutionally, the way that commitment gets expressed is through these really tangible, material, concrete relationships with others. So the philosophy has some legs and feet, which sometimes is not the case in certain Christian circles. And I'm curious, maybe we could start talking a little bit about your work in Asia. How does that work that you do there relate to some of this philosophy that you're telling us about? And what's that work look like for you? Who are you talking with? What is it like for you to sort of be with others in the role that you are in at the United Church?
As I said a little earlier, the United Church, while we understand ourselves as rooted in Canada and a product of our context and history, we see ourselves as related across the wider world. Other parts of the Christian family, other parts of the human family. Although the United Church was created in 1925 through this act of union, through its predecessor or constituent churches, it had some history. The Methodists, the Presbyterians, and the Congregationalists, they all have mission history that took them as part of that 19th century missionary movement to various parts of the world. So part of our engagement today as the United Church in Northeast Asia, in China, Japan, Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and elsewhere is a product of those long-term relationships that started in the mid to late 1800s, as there was this kind of Western missionary movement that was pretty missionary and colonial in its impulses, and took folk to parts of the world to share what they understood as the good news. The United Church and its antecedents, the Methodists and the Presbyterians and Congregationalists, had a very strong commitment to the social gospel, the material well-being of people, as well as their spiritual health. So in places like China, the Korean Peninsula, Japan as well, Where the United Church really got involved was in areas like education, particularly for girls, those who didn't have much opportunity for education, health, and social well-being. Also in leadership development. So education, health, leadership development, in ways that kind of distinguished the United Church from some of the other missionary churches that were pretty careful in maintaining control, both in terms of witness and structure and leadership. The United Church really tried its best to develop relationship with the people of the place. So, in Korea, for example, the United Church established what was called the Canadian Mission in 1898 in what was then Wonsan, in what is now North Korea. And that particular focus remains something that is quite cherished by Koreans that I encounter today. The focus that the Canadians gave to training and building capacity among Koreans in those areas of education, health, and leadership development in the church.
That's all really helpful context, I think, that will definitely give a lot of the conversation, some good highlights. But maybe we could pivot to talking more about the Korean Peninsula and some of your specific
Sure.
work there. That might be a
Sure.
good way to go right
Sure.
now. Anyone could pick up a history book and read about the history of the Korean Peninsula and read about the Korean War. But listen, people aren't doing that. I think that the Korean War is, at least in my experience as a person in the U.S., is something that that a lot of people just don't even know about. But I think it'd be really helpful if you could, not exhaustively perhaps, but you could tell the story about the DPRK and the ROK. I guess how did the tensions there begin, and what role are you and the United Church playing in peace and solidarity work in that
Yeah,
region?
thanks. Maybe I would start out by saying that the Korean War cannot and should not be described as a war between North Korea and South Korea, or North and South Koreans. And if we had a map here, I would point to just the location of where the Korean Peninsula is, and say that the geopolitics of the region have meant that throughout much of its 5,000-year history, that the Korean Peninsula has been a battleground. A battleground for the bigger superpowers, and throughout its history, the Korean people have often suffered quite terribly. People may know that Korea was liberated from Japan after World War II in 1945, and that liberation came after some 35, close to 40 years of quite brutal occupation by the Japanese. So Japan lost the war, Western Allies won, and at the time of the Japanese surrender, the Allied forces in the Korean Peninsula and what was then the Soviet Union was also on the peninsula, and it is said that someone in the Allied command took a pen at the 38th parallel and divided the peninsula north and south. At the time, the Soviet Union was occupying the north, and the U.S. was occupying the south. Some few years later, I'm going to jump a little bit, the Korean War started in 1950, when ostensibly the North Korean Communist Army that was supplied and advised by the Soviet Union crossed over the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. And some 17 countries, including Canada, fought the Northern-led forces under the flag of the UN and the US command. I think, as you say, a lot of people could pick up the history books or look at Wikipedia, but I think it's really important to note that the Korean War is understood by many as an outgrowth of the Cold War, not simply because it was the specter of communism against democracy, but it was really about who controls and who benefits globally, and particularly in that region of the world. And those superpowers that were involved, Soviet Union, China, the US under the UN, heading the UN command, were pretty clear that they didn't want, quote, the other side to dominate. So some 3 years later, 1953, the Korean War came to what I would call a pause, not an end. In July 1953, an armistice was signed that paused and did not end the war. So it's really important to stress that an unresolved war has not come to a resolution in the Korean Peninsula. There continues to be a state of war in that area. Part of the legacy of that war, records vary, but most would agree that approximately 5 million people were killed during the Korean War. At least 2.5, at least half of those, and probably more, were civilians. Approximately a million Chinese soldiers, and then tens of thousands of other combatants, American, of course, South Korean, Canadian, and thousands of others that were marshaled as part of the UN force. I remember someone told me once that in the Korean War, which again was not I would never characterize as a war of North Koreans against South Koreans, more than 10% of the pre-war population, of Korea's pre-war population, was killed as a result of the war. And that's a higher percentage than either the civilian casualties of World War II or the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. So, the current reality of the Korean Peninsula is one of unresolved war, where people certainly in the north, but also in the south, live in the reality that is bound by, some would call an extremely fragile armistice, and that state of war is at the root of the continued tensions, conflict, hostility in the peninsula, and it continues to fuel those tensions. It continues the militarization in the north, in the south, among those who are allied. And carries with it major economic and political costs, I would say, again, for the North, the South, and for Western countries who continue to be involved in the military tensions there. You asked how is the United Church involved, and I'm getting to that too. I think I tried to say earlier that the United Church has history in the Korean Peninsula. Formally, we our roots go to the Canadian mission of the late 1890s. The Korean Canadian relationship is a varied and diverse one. Certainly, the United Church of Canada sees its relationships with the Korean people, those who have roots in the north or those who have roots in the south, as a very deep and treasured one. If you had to ask me why, I'd have to stop for a moment. I mean, why is it? whether it's a kind of a connection that's beyond certainly faith and a spiritual bonds, but for all kinds of reasons, which I could think about. Canada too is like most other countries, I guess, also subject to its own geopolitical position as well. Living beside a superpower and the effects that it has, but nevertheless. Canadians and Koreans, I think, have a deep and special bond. The United Church has deep and treasured strong partnerships in the South, and continues to have partnerships in the North as well. Our approach is one of partnership, that is to forefront and amplify the voices of partners. And without a doubt, the voices of our partners in these times are speaking about the importance of peace and reconciliation in the peninsula. And that means ending the war, a peace agreement, and working at the process towards reconciliation.
That's all really great, Patty, and I appreciate that you've summarized a very complicated and long history in a very short amount of time. So kudos to you for that. Yeah, I think there's so much to be said on the Korean Peninsula in general, right? The Republic of Korea, the South Korean part, has obviously had a long history of its own kind of challenges and a voice for justice there, and things like Minjung theology, or etc. And of course, North Korea has its own challenges globally and otherwise internally. One thing that I think has helped us as Christians understand when it comes to sorting through complicated situations is that, there might be Christians living in those situations who have a particular perspective as well that might not be the same as ours, or it might be sort of unique or something else. And you mentioned the United Church has these partnerships on both sides of the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, if we want to put it that way. Maybe you could tell us a bit what that relationship is like. I think we can get to the South Korean partnerships in a moment, which is obviously very, very important. But I think a lot of people are, and myself included, it's hard to know anything about what's going on in North Korea for lots of reasons. So, what are the partnerships that the United Church has on that side of the parallel? What are those partnerships like? And what do those Christians seem to be saying about the peace process and their own hopes for their country?
Yeah, the United Church has been part of a network of Christian churches that has tried to now for about 30 years facilitate some encounters between Christians from North Korea and South Korea, and between North Korean Christians and Christians in other parts of the world. For a couple of decades, two, 3 decades after the armistice in 1953, there was really next to no connection, I think, with those who had roots and continue to be in North Korea. You may know, I neglected to say that during the war, part of the fear and the conflict drove much of the what was then the population of the North into the South, and the Korean Christian churches, now very strongly rooted in the South. Many of them will talk about their history in what is now North Korea. That the North is where much of the cradle, I guess, the roots of modern day Korean Christianity are set. And it was the war that caused huge flows of refugees, pushed those Christians and others during the conflict into the South. So those Christians who are in the South will talk about the places, the communities, the churches, the history in the North, although they themselves were pushed into into the south. And so for some years, I think there was some, deep concern and question about, is there a continuing Christian community of any kind in the north? What was its situation? What was its lot? What was its reality? And it was first in I think it was the mid 1980s that there began to be some limited channels for communication with the Christian community that remained small and fragile. In the north, the Protestant Christian community goes by the name of the Korean Christian Federation. And through the Korean Christian Federation, or the KCF, there were some tentative initiatives that were made through the World Council of Churches, a global fellowship of Christian, Protestant, Anglican, Orthodox churches, and a historic meeting was held in Japan. Today, continuing to this day, the national security law in Korea prohibits Koreans from the south to meet or communicate with Koreans in the north. As I said, that country continues to be in a state of war, and the national security apparatus in the south, which earlier in the 1980s and 90s was the cause of much of the human rights violations that happened in the south. Today, it continues to limit the connection between North and South Koreans of any kind. So in the 80s, there was an historic meeting, the first one since the Korean War, that was held in Japan in a place called Tosanso, a YMCA retreat center. And the Tosanso process for the building of connection, mutual visits, some interchurch relationships, some people-to-people exchanges, that developed for the next 20 or 30 years to where we are today, to the place where we have, as I say, fragile and limited connections with the small Christian community that is gathered under the umbrella of the Korean Christian Federation in the north. Over those 30 years, I've been to North Korea several times, and I've also had the privilege of meeting North Koreans elsewhere. During those years, I think there has been a lot learned. We know that the Christian community in Korea exists. We know that it is a small and fragile one. We know that it seeks relationship with the global Christian family. And we know that there are differences among us. Some of those differences relate to our understanding of the role of the state, the understanding of the role of state leadership. And I think we also know that we want to collaborate in spite of differences, and not let those differences create yet another obstacle. I think our hope is that we would work to a place where things like people-to-people visits and encounters of various type could happen. Those have been limited, certainly given the geopolitics of the last few years. And just when we got to a stage where we thought there was going to be some opening in 2018, 2019, and then COVID in 2020 happened. So, we're at a place where, for the United Church and others, we remain committed to seeking all opportunities that we can to connect with Christians in the North.
It's really helpful just to get a handle on some of what's happening there. I think some people who are listening might be surprised to learn that there are Christians, let alone religious people, in the DPRK. I think that might be a surprise to some people. I think when people bring up those kinds of topics about religious people in the DPRK, I think a lot of the conversations seem to center on the narrative around religious persecution. And I'm wondering if you could help us think through some of that. What might be a good way to, I don't know, have that conversation or think through it? What are the questions or experiences that you've had that might help us work through some of that?
Good question. And maybe I'll use an example that not just of Korea here, but the Chinese history. China, the superpower, big neighbor of Korea too. The West has a long and complicated history in China, and so too does the Christian Church. And a lot of the current reality, of course, there's roots in there's a legacy there that history and colonial practice has left. There was a time in China where the saying was one more Christian, one less Chinese. And so the Christian church in China today, and that's not very long ago, that's barely a century ago, where the understanding of Christianity meant a rejection of things Chinese, culture, history, knowledge, spirituality. So my experience in China, learning from Chinese partners, has been to listen hard to what it means for Chinese Christians to live out a spirituality that is rooted in the soil of China, of their place, and not constrained by the pot in which it was transplanted or carried by Western missionaries. I think in Korea there's also that dynamic. The DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, feels very isolated, very threatened, very much on its own, which is probably a genuine and authentic reflection of reality. It understands itself in a continued state of war against not only the South, but the Western forces, particularly that personified in the U.S. And so for Christians who are also intensely proud and patriotic, it is very challenging then to live out the fully that identity of being Christian and Korean. I could say the same, Christian and Canadian. What does that mean for us? So I certainly, people have talked about it as a dance. I think it's been more challenging and certainly difficult than a dance in most cases, and continues to be so. I think the reality of a authoritarian system that rules in a context of control and war footing has meant that the challenge of reflecting the one's pride in what North Koreans have been able to accomplish, and also speak about connections with the West of whatever kind, are quite complex and difficult.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I mean the situation is complex and difficult. I'm sure, so it makes it's no surprise that Christianity has to be complex too, and navigate a lot of different things going on there. I feel like I have a thousand other questions about that, but maybe we can get to them in the context of some of the solidarity work too. There's been a movement for peace on the Korean Peninsula, motivated by people all over the peninsula. There was a lot of kind of strange steps forward and backward with the Trump administration. It remains to be seen what will happen with the Biden administration, I guess. But, nevertheless, there's this kind of groundswell of hope for peace. And you've been involved with that. The solidarity work that you do is really coalitional, and there's lots of coalitions surrounding this peace process, especially with women and centering justice for women in particular. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that. What's that sort of movement for peace like now, and how do these sort of coalitions of justice interests, maybe with women in particular and feminism, tie into those calls for peace?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I mean, I said I spoke earlier of the the deepest yearning of the Korean people is that I've encountered. Among the deepest yearnings is this yearning for reconciliation, that there might be a way of moving toward addressing the brokenness not only of society, the separation of families, but also the brokenness of their country as well. And that would be a process, not necessarily an agreed upon endpoint. And I think in these last years, yes, there's been really a groundswell of movement, and particularly Koreans joining in coalition in transnational and global networks. One of the networks that I've spoken about is the Christian Church connection through the World Council of Churches, committed, as I said, to forefronting and amplifying the voices of partners, Korean partners who are providing the leadership in their own country and context about to address some of the voices that are more militaristic and claiming a war footing. Another key network for us, for the United Church, is the feminist transnational global campaign for peace in the peninsula, that's taken on the focus of Korea Peace Now. It's a campaign that was launched officially in March of 2019, and it's an initiative that was that's been organized by several feminist networks from across the globe, the US based Women Cross DMZ, the Nobel Women's Peace Initiative, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and the Korean Women's Movement for Peace, which again is a large coalition of Korean women's movements that have been organizing and advocating and educating about the urgency for peace for decades. And I really want to put Korean women in the center of this movement, which is now growing, I think, as a transnational and global one. And I think that the Korea Peace Now campaign, which is a feminist-led and global one, has really centered the importance of not only acting for peace, but women's voices, women's leadership in peace. And there's all kinds of reasons why that's important, but I maybe boil them down to two, and that is that we know that women suffer disproportionately in contexts of conflict and war, and that's true anywhere, not just Korea. And we also know there's good research, good data that shows us that peace agreements are more grounded and more durable when women, civil society organizations, but women's voices and women's networks, particularly when they are included. So the Korea Peace Now campaign, has said that the imperative right now is to continue the focus on ending the war. A lot of Canadians, I'm not sure about Americans, but a lot of Canadians wouldn't know that the Korean War didn't end in 1953. So that is a key call of the Korea Peace Now campaign, that the war needs to end. And there are some other things as well that are forefronted by the campaign that we've been picking up from partners and trying to support in solidarity for years. A key one being the humanitarian impact of sanctions. Another being the cost of the ongoing militarization of the peninsula, the cost in Korea and the cost in our own countries of the U.S. and Canada and elsewhere. And maybe a fourth one would be the imperative of maximizing opportunities for dialogue rather than pressure. So I would say, that United Church partners have for decades been speaking some of those imperatives. To see it now taken up in a new way by transnational, global civil society networks, I think have really grounded the campaign and the solidarity thrusts in new ways that cross a whole number of horizons. And just when it's kind of when one initiative kind of gets blocked, the creativity, the reach that working in coalition means, that coalition holds, means that other alternatives can be explored. So for the United Church of Canada, collaboration, coalition is the only way to move forward in peace solidarity.
It's such a great thing to hear about the resilience of that coalition. Really an inspiring thing, I think, to hear how folks around the world are working this out. A minute ago, though, you did mention a few things about economic sanctions, and I think that's something important to draw out of the conversation. It's hard to talk about the Korean Peninsula and the DPRK without drawing some special attention to those sanctions. I mean, like you've been saying this entire conversation, right? There's a ceasefire, but the war isn't over, and I think that is maybe one way to think about sanctions. The violence is still happening, but in sort of a different way, along the lines of economic sanctions that make it, impossible for people in the DPRK to get access to things like, very basic things like medicine or nutrition or, other things like that. So, I mean, from my perspective as a person in the U.S., it seems needlessly cruel and awful. But like, what's the point? I guess why is what's the U.S. hoping to gain from these kinds of sanctions? Is there any kind of way to push back and maybe to work to end them?
Yeah, good question. Sanctions are meant to be non-military methods of international relationships that are to be diplomatic and related means of creating behavior change. I think there's probably a much better definition by the book of what sanctions are meant to be, but I would take issue that they are without certainly they are the cause of conflict and continue to provide the seeds for continued conflict. I think the purpose of sanctions, at least the named purpose, is to force North Korea into line and follow a Western prescribed set of rules of international law, and to press for denuclearization. The US, the UN will talk about the sanctions really as focused on pressing for the denuclearization of North Korea, and that isolation through sanctions, pressure would lead that regime to give up their weapons that are seen not simply as defensive but offensive weapons. And I think the evidence is there before us that decades of sanctions, the most restrictive regime of sanctions that has been applied by the UN are the set of sanctions against the DPRK. Those sanctions have not had the intended effect. If the intended effect was to denuclearize North Korea, that has not happened. In fact, many would say it's done the opposite. It's only strengthened North Korea's resolve to be a nuclear power. And it's only when North Korea jumps up and down and shouts and screams and tests a nuclear weapon that it gets the attention of the West. Certainly, we know that the sanctions policies have impacted the most vulnerable, women, children, the aged, rural populations disproportionately. There's good data. Women across DMZ and the Korea Peace Now have produced some excellent, well-documented papers that have shown the gendered impact of sanctions, the health impact of sanctions. It is clear that those sanctions are having disproportionate effect on those who are most vulnerable, not on the military, not on the leadership, but those who are most vulnerable. And despite being one of the most isolated, one of the most sanctioned, and certainly one of the most pressured countries in the world, North Korea now has more nuclear weapons than it did when sanctions were first applied. And there is some certainty that North Korean weapons, missiles, may have the capacity to hit the North American, the U.S. mainland. We in the humanitarian community, in the faith community, in civil society organizations, have said that not only are sanctions not working if the intended goal is to change behavior and seek denuclearization, it has moved us, the international community, backwards from that goal and further from that goal of denuclearization, not only of North Korea but of the peninsula, and it has hardened the resolve, I think, of North Koreans to dig in and to be as isolated and independent as possible. I think there has been, a whole slew of double standards as well. The UN has indicated that these sanctions are not intended to impede humanitarian actions. We have well documented data that shows that the sanctions do indeed impede humanitarian engagement. There's well documented evidence that the sanctions that have been focused on the transportation sector and the global finance sector lead those sectors to really resist and be unwilling to either support or transport humanitarian goods. And so even actors like the United Church of Canada or other faith-based organizations, NGOs working in maternal child health, agricultural support, food security, etc., will tell you story upon story about how banks will refuse to offer financial services because of fear of retaliation by Western and mostly U.S.-based financial systems. So the North Koreans will see that although the UN has indicated that humanitarian actions are exempt from sanctions, in fact, that's dried up. The commitment to maintaining some sort of corridor for humanitarian actors that has turned out to be an empty commitment. Dr. Key Park, well-known American surgeon, will tell you that the conditions in North Korean hospitals are dire because they lack basic medicines and equipment to maintain basic response to acute medical and health situations. The cost of sanctions is being wreaked upon those who are again most vulnerable and least able to affect change. Our approach as civil society networks and coalitions, and certainly the approach of South Koreans, is to stress the importance of engagement and dialogue at every point, rather than sanctioning, a mix of carrot and stick rather than a strategy that's all stick.
That makes a lot of sense, and it's helpful to contextualize sanctions that way. I mean, they do get defended as the nonviolent option, but they sort of carry on a different sort of violence, or a more difficult violence to see. As we end, I'll pose a question to you that we often pose to Jim Hodgson as well, which is, as there is this kind of groundswell for peace and trying to get people to oppose these sanctions, etc., what is it that we can do as people, Christians, people who care about peace, or otherwise living in the imperial core, in the aggressor nations on our side? What can we do to sort of help show solidarity and build that energy for peace in Korea?
Yeah, I think there are some things that we can do as individuals and as communities, as nation states as well. I think part of it is to seek ourselves to become better informed and seek some of the alternate narratives, which would use some different images of what the conflict is. There's a great little NGO in Cambodia called the Center for Peace for Conflict Studies. And one of the things that they did in 2020 was a series of short videos of North Korean life. And their purpose was to normalize North Korean people. So their first video was about love and marriage in North Korea. And they talked about some of the challenges of young people, finding a partner and setting up a house or a home on their own. So I think that's one thing that we can do, as individuals: seek to be well informed, seek to look for what are the alternate narratives, and ask some questions around some of the stereotypes that are used again and again about the conflict and about North Korea. I also think too that particularly in North America, there is a wide and highly experienced and wise Korean diaspora. The Korean diaspora has particular power to help those of us who don't understand the context. So if your neighbor, next door, upstairs, is Korean, open that conversation about the current reality of Korea and its history. My hunch is that there may be quite a wide variety of responses that one would encounter, but it would help, I think, many of us a more nuanced understanding. I think maybe the last word I would say is that, as a person of faith, I think the hope and desire is that, all can live in a situation of wholeness and peace. Jesus was asked the question, who is my neighbor? Part of the response was that the neighbor was the least likely person that you might think about, not the person who looks like you or who sounds like you, but the person who is perhaps the most despised. How do we seek out with compassion those who are different and seek to understand and together move toward a more just and peaceful world?
Thanks, Patti. I think that's a great note to end on. It's been great to have you on the show, and we appreciate you sharing a bit with us about your work in Korea. We'll have to have you back soon to talk to us about China and elsewhere.
Matt, Dean, thanks very much, and all the very best to you.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/Magnificast. If you support us there, you can get us all kinds of really neat things like a special Patreon-only podcast or an invite to our Discord channel. We even have some new Patreon-only stickers that are really neat that you'll probably want. I don't know. So you can give us some money, but if you can't, that's fine too. We don't really care that much. You can also just give us a nice review on iTunes. Rate us, review us. That always helps too, to game the big algorithmic system that we find ourselves in the middle of. Our intro music is by Amari Armstrong, and our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would have